Why do people love Japanese saws? Now, when designing a saw, you have to select the material you're going to be making your saw blade out of. The balance you're trying to find is you want to make sure that you have a straight cut, a blade that's stiff enough to give you that straight cut and doesn't just wander. But you also want it to be thin so that it doesn't waste a lot of material and it doesn't require too much power to actually drive the saw and cut the material. Now, if you make the material really thin, it'll waste the least amount of material and it'll be super easy to cut, which is why most hand saws are, super thin. But if you make it too thin, it's just gonna be flimsy. Every time you go for a cut, it'll bend, it might break easy. But on the opposite side of the spectrum, if you make it too thick, it's gonna require way too much power, and most people might not be able to cut it with hand, which is why it's okay for circular saws and other power tools to have such thick blades, because they'll last long, but you don't need human power to cut. There's a motor that's doing all the work, and it'll give you a pretty straight cut every time. If you have a thin material like this saw, like this push saw, and you're pushing it, you can have deflection in the blade. Now, of course, you can make it thicker, but that'll make it much harder to cut, and you'll waste a lot of material. So how can you have a saw that's nice and thin, doesn't waste too much material, doesn't require too much power, you can easily cut and manipulate the blade, but still has a straight edge? It doesn't, cut it at an angle. Well, that's where the principle of the push versus pull comes in. Because if I take something thin like this and I try to push it, it'll collapse. But if I put it under tension, if I was to pull it, it'll always form a straight line. Any material, no matter how hard it is, has some amount of flex built into it. You see this with very thick bars. Even diamonds have a little bit of give to them. Obviously, the harder the material, the less it gives to a set amount of force. And the weaker and softer material, the more it'll give to the same amount of force. Now, if I have a string here, and if you were to look at your saw blade as the string, if you push it, it doesn't hold its shape. But if you pull it, from where the teeth are engaging to where you're applying the force, it'll always create a straight line. And this is why people love Japanese saws, because wherever the teeth engage on the material to where you're pulling, it's creating that straight line and giving you a super straight cut. Whereas with a push saw, if your teeth get stuck somewhere and you push on it, you might warp the blade at an angle. So it takes a real skill to actually use a push saw and get the best and straight cuts out of it. You gotta go gentle, not put too much pressure into it, but let the blades do all the cutting, especially until you have a channel, and then you can really maybe put some force on it. But for the most time, you don't want to be pushing down on a push saw. You just want to gently glide the teeth over the surface that you're cutting. And the same principle applies for the pull as well, to be honest. You don't want to be pulling down on it nice and hard. You just want the blade to do all the work. But you just have much more control over the blade and how straight it cuts. And you can make these blades very thin, and they're going to be even more flexible than your push saw blade because they can be thinner. But it doesn't matter if it has this flex, because every time you go to cut, it'll pull itself straight and give you a nice, clean, straight cut. And that's why everybody loves Japanese pull saws, and so many people are converting over to the Japanese saws over the conventional push saw.